What we're going to talk about today is the proven success framework for platform engineering initiatives. And it's essentially how you're going to get started in doing all of this without losing your marbles or your shirt. What we are going to talk about is the minimum viable platform, and it's more than just a confusing acronym, because as much as I like to confuse people with acronyms, it actually makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, let's just get into it. Like I said, I'm based in Ontario, Canada, and I have a couple different roles at Humanitech. I am the principal platform advocate, as well as the head of customer success. You may also see me around the interwebs talking a lot about platform engineering, teaching a lot about platform engineering. So I teach quite a bit of the certification course, as well as do a lot of in-person coaching. I like to call it platform therapy sometimes for folks, just to help them along the way with their initiative, because I see so many of these every single day. One thing I will note is that if you want to ask questions during the presentation, you can pop them in the chat. There's the Q&A function as well. Feel free to use those. I want to leave as much time as possible to get to those questions, because there's always fantastic ones in these webinars. And if you need to get in touch with me outside of the webinar, so not just the Slack community that Carla shared, so the platformengineering.org Slack, but you can also email me. I suppose I have a Twitter/X account. I just don't really use it. So good luck getting in touch with me there, because it's not going to happen. You can, however, find me on LinkedIn and see all the unhinged farmer content I post about relating farming to platform engineering. You might find it interesting. So in today's talk, I want to go over a couple of things. I want to go over what the minimum viable platform actually is and why you should do one. I'm also going to break it down into the 4 phases. These are standardized phases that we have built through time, effort, error, and lots of learning that you can take and start your own MVP with. I'm also going to give you some very common pitfalls and solutions to those pitfalls that can help you avoid the pit of platform engineering despair. That's always something quite interesting to see how people are getting along with these initiatives, and being able to help guide you away from potential problems before you even have them. And then at the end, I want to touch a little bit on how you're going to go beyond MVP and what you need to think about in order to do that. So let's just start off with, what is the minimum viable platform? It's a great question. It's a lot of things, but in general, you can sum it up in a couple different ways. So you can sum it up as being a way to show value in platform engineering initiatives very quickly. And the idea is that it's quick. The way you do this is by following a proven structure, a pathway that is a fairly refined and confined scope, technically, with the goal to not only identify a pioneering team that's going to lead the way on innovation here. So that's your platform engineering team, as well as the first app teams you'll start working with, but also it's going to give you a representative first version of your internal developer platform. So generally speaking, we'll do this in the context of the pioneering team that we're working with, and work around non-production requirements. I will say that is a very hard rule I have. You are not touching production inside of MVPs. You're also going to, by the end of this, have yourself a little product-like roadmap for iteration and growth. We know one of the rules of platform engineering is treat your platform like a product. The MVP is no exception. The goal here is also to seek out and engage the folks that are influential in driving adoption. So not just people that sign checks, but also people that make decisions technically from a team perspective and in terms of the direction things go. You'll have to get those stakeholders on board quickly and maintain excitement to really follow the MVP pathway as well. And by nature, it's fairly easy to do because of the speed at which it moves. One of the cool things that happens when you do this is that you avoid having to win every single technical team over right away, and you can scale sensibly throughout your entire org. So you're not just saying, okay, here it is, now everyone needs to onboard. You have a plan, you're very clear about that plan, and you start in a very sustainable way. That doesn't tend to scare people off, because that does happen. When we look at designing MVPs, they need to be these 3 primary things. And this isn't just from a technical perspective, by the way. This is also from kind of a workflow and organizational perspective and a change management focus. So the first thing needs to be is representative. It needs to represent a commonality inside of your engineering org. So this means the same basic resources that most teams are using. This means that the components are common. So let's say you have CI and CD tools that most teams are using. Maybe those are the first ones you want to bring in. Perhaps you have a common database type, similar ingress, similar DNS rules, networking. That needs to be applied from a technical perspective to the design. If you have a common application structure, so let's say you have a front end and a back end service, and maybe they connect into a dependent data layer, that is something that you want to make sure you have in place too. It is so important to do this right because the idea is at the end of this, you're going to show this to potential customers, aka your developers, and they need to be able to see themselves in the context of that platform. If you are a Java shop and you bring in a Python example app, you're going to just ostracize people. It doesn't make sense to them. If you are a private cluster kind of shop and everything's done inside of private clusters and inside of very heavily firewalled networks, it doesn't make sense to show people an example where that isn't set up inside of the MVP. It just is going to lead to more questions than actual adoption. The next thing you need to do is make sure the MVP is repeatable. So what you do inside of it should be able to be reused, not just from a technical perspective, but also from an organizational perspective later on. The process is a quick start. What you do in terms of scoping an MVP out, how you ask your target customer, aka your developers, the questions about what they want, that is all reusable in the future. Think of it like a quick start. Think of it like the foundation of the house that is your platform. And no one wants a rickety foundation. So make sure that what you're doing is sustainable and able to be repeated time and time again. Don't reinvent the wheel. It also, though, needs to be iterative. So one of the most important things I often have to remind people of throughout the MVP process is that it's okay to start small and it's going to get bigger and it's going to get more impressive over time. The whole idea behind the MVP is to create a baseline version of the platform that you'll grow over time. And that iteration is just by nature part of the process. You need to be committed to scale these things. And I think if you take that mindset from the beginning, it becomes much easier to do. So start small, think of the future on the horizon. You're going to build a roadmap and just know that you are trying to show value in this as fast as you can. And if you bite off too much more than you can chew right away, it just won't happen. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So let's look at the 4 phases and how you're going to break the MVP down into a sustainable batch of tasks. Now, you could think of these as sprints, or you could think of them as just a general to-do list. It doesn't really matter to me. The important thing is that you need to be able to achieve these outcomes inside of these 4 phases. So the first phase is the discovery phase. What you're going to do is look at the technical outcomes that you need to achieve inside of a very brief period of time. So 8 weeks is generally the max here. And discover the golden paths that you want teams to walk down. So by golden paths, you can think of user stories. What are the biggest pain points your teams have now, and how can you show them a better way? Maybe that's just changing variables inside of the context of a particular workload in a deployment or requesting a new dependency. If you can find those golden paths that people have issues with now and make improvements in them, it is much easier to get adoption at the end. The other thing you're going to want to do here is project planning and PM alignment, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And it is incredibly important inside of the discovery phase to have all of that together. Phase 2 is integration. So here's where you're going to set up the baseline platform. Connect your runtime environments, connect your resource dependencies, make sure that you are taking into consideration what needs to be shared and what needs to be very specific, and make sure that that infrastructure is integrated in a way that makes sense in the context of just the MVP for now. You can scale it later. Phase 3 is deployment, and this is when the application itself comes in. So bring in the workloads, get those dependencies interconnected to each other, make sure the CI and CD pipelines work in the right way. So if it's basically automatically coming in to the platform, it needs to be set up so that it works, and it works independently of whoever is using it. It needs to be able to be tested by a lot of different people. On the adoption side of things, you need to be able to have an end-to-end demo. So you could be demoing against those initial golden paths that we showed. You could also be demoing against an overall target. So, hey, maybe we want to reduce time to market. How can we showcase that with the MVP demo that we have? But what's important is that you are able to do flow testing and demos against the things you did in discovery. So the technical outcomes, business objectives, all that fun stuff. Finally, you also want to have that adoption and roadmap plan kind of finalized in that phase 4 so that you have something when you go to do demos. Hey, here's what's next. We want your input. It's very, very important. And just remember to keep the infrastructure and application simple, representative, and very scalable, and you'll have a much easier time doing this stuff down the road. Some pitfalls and the built-in solutions that platform engineering has kind of out of the box and the MVP has out of the box to prevent these. So if you follow the structure of the MVP correctly, you are going to avoid some of these common problems. And the first one I see is rushing to complexity. So that is where you just rush to get everything, all of the problems of the world solved all at once because it has to be perfect in order for anybody to adopt it. And I will tell you that every single time that fails. I've yet to see that actually have a successful platform come out of it because it never gets done and it never goes anywhere and you never show it to anyone. The best practice on the other side is to start small, iterate, and grow. Like I said, it's about continuous improvement. It's about treating it like a product. Products start with MVPs, that minimum viable product, and they grow based on user feedback. And that is the way you have to think about this stuff. It's exactly the same. The other thing I see people fail at is that they focus only on tools and tech stack. And I cannot tell you the amount of times I have had to reality check a team by saying, guys, it's nice that we have toys in our sandbox here, but we actually are trying to solve some problems. So the best practice is to focus on solving those problems. Focus on the golden path so you're able to support at the start and make sure that you're tracking how those are used and how they're adopted. It's about using technology to solve problems, not creating more problems by just stacking technology on top of each other. Something else you'll want to keep in mind is that it is very easy to build a platform that no one will use. And what I mean by that is you can go all out making assumptions and build something, but at the end of the day, if no one uses it, it doesn't matter. People don't adopt it. So how are you going to avoid this? You'll focus on your user, on your customer, on your developers, and the right level of abstraction that they need to have in order to be productive and in order to show impact as well as improve satisfaction with their day-to-day. You can see that the trend here is that everything is very outcome driven. So keep that in mind. And the last one I want to highlight that is something that becomes, I think, more and more apparent to me every single team I work with is that it is often developer experience as a concept is perceived to only be about developers and that everybody else doesn't matter. But that's actually simply not true. Developer experience is about solving community problems that focus on that development lifecycle, on those teams' interactions with others, and the whole software development process. So the best practice is to find pioneers and to build champions from them and build that community around solving problems inside of the entire technical space, not just for that individual developer. And at the end of the day, it's about Pareto efficiency. So by making something easier for someone else, you shouldn't make another thing harder for another part of the team. It all needs to be succinct and work together and solve problems for everybody. I know that is easier said than done, but I promise you it's very possible. So what happens beyond MVP? And this is sort of something I want to drill a little bit deeper on because I get asked about it all the time. There are so many ways to approach doing an MVP, and there's a lot of great reference architectures out there on the web on how to do these. But how do you actually take these things to scale? And we'll touch on this a little bit, but I want to first start with the challenges that you're likely to face, because I think if you flag the minefield early, you're more likely to avoid these problems because you'll recognize them before they even become a giant fire. You'll recognize the spark. So when it comes to enterprise adoption specifically, some of these things can also be applied to smaller, medium businesses, startups, all those fun things, but the scale is very different. So we'll focus in on enterprise because that tends to be the biggest question and the biggest problem. In enterprises, the technical complexity is hugely increased and the whole technical estate covers a lot more ground. It's bigger and it's a lot more complex. These enterprises also require a much higher level of stakeholder management for entire org adoption to actually happen. So it's not just about getting a CTO or a manager to sign something off and say, yep, go ahead, build this thing. It often has to be tied into a much bigger initiative. And with that, adoption itself at an enterprise scale has to be incredibly well planned and incredibly well managed. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. But what's important to understand is that if you don't have a plan, you will fail. The saying I was always taught was fail to plan, plan to fail. And there's also a rule in enterprises about how 80/20 the 80/20 rule that tends to come in these initiatives shifts. So that generally means you're going to build something that will represent 80% of scenarios in the start of your platform after MVP and wait on those 20% of outliers until later. But this can shift. That 20% of outliers that may have a different infrastructure requirement, may have different pipelines, may be incredibly critical components that the rest of the organization relies on. So maybe it's a data analysis tool or a data consumption tool. This is where I see this the most often, or something like a CDN or some other critical component that other applications rely heavily on that actually needs to be migrated first in order for everything else to be streamlined and smooth. So those are the kind of things you might want to think about in an enterprise context that may have to come sooner than later. And the final thing is that legacy systems are going to haunt enterprises. They're going to be problematic. There's unfortunately no way to avoid legacy in enterprise. I can't think of the amount of banks that I talk to that are still heavily mainframe focused. It's always scary when you think about where your money lives, but it's very true and it's still very much there. And there are ways to think about it in the context of platform engineering. So how do you counter these things? Well, it's a combination of a lot of different rules and tools and things you need to think about. And the first one is that those high-level stakeholders need to be engaged very, very early on, and you continually need to prove to them value and ROI. I will give you a little bit more detail about that, but that's kind of the thing to focus in on. Value and ROI are so important to stakeholders. You have to be able to show it to them in their context. Don't go show a CEO that isn't very technical a bunch of interface information about how pipelines work. They don't really care. The next thing that you'll want to do is plan around technical complexity with focused and phased project plans and roadmaps. You'll want a good project manager in place to help you with this. And you'll also want to make sure, which is the next point, that project management is aligned between the platform team and the application team. Another thing that's not on here that is also very important is have product ownership. Your platform is a product. There needs to be someone acting as a product owner as well. So not just project management, but product. When it comes to that 20%, you want to start thinking about them very early and build the migration strategy support their onboarding. So we'll look at the cyclical iteration cycle for onboarding, but it's important to know that there may be things like this that you need to look at identifying at the very start in order to make sure that you're ready to meet their needs before you look at the rest of the org. And then finally, consider where and if legacy systems even fit in and any initiatives that might exist to move away from them and how you can get involved in those early when effectively any refactoring would be considered greenfield. So let's look a little bit more in depth at some of these. When it comes to engaging the high-level stakeholders, you're going to just think about outcomes. That is so, so important. And start early doing this. Share project plans with them. Have defined success criteria against outcomes. It sounds very non-engineer, but it's so critically important when you're trying to get adoption on something that is not just technical, but very change focused. The outcomes you're thinking about need to align with business priorities. So this is stuff like being revenue driven. This is stuff like time to market and out competing your competitors. This is stuff like cost savings, or it's even things about increasing innovation or trying new things. It's a lot of different stuff you can align platform engineering initiatives to. Regularly also report on your progress towards those success criteria and outcomes. Have regular check-ins and say, hey, here's where we're at. Even if it's just an email that says, here's something that happened this week in this initiative that you might like, it's important to pass that on. Include the wins in the team light bulb moments. And a good example of that is I've had customers who've had some early demos with their developer teams and their developers go, holy cow, this would make my day-to-day so much better. And I didn't even realize how bad it was until I saw a better way. Stuff like that. Light bulb moments, all matters. You can do this by scheduling demos and updates as part of what are called QBRs, so quarterly business reviews. Some other names get thrown around for these, but basically it's management level update meetings where managers come together and talk about what they're working on that quarter, that half, that year, and update the rest of the management team. And how you want to do that is show ROI as you see it. So time is money, and anything that reduces time for common tasks is a huge cost saver. So take advantage of being able to showcase that as it happens, and prove it out with metrics. I also talked about aligning project management strategies with migration plans, and I want to touch on that a little bit further. So it is so important that project management is strong and there's a good collaboration between platform project managers and application or developer team project managers. If you don't have this, it's very easy to fall off the rails. I have seen it happen where there isn't alignment, there's disagreement here, and one team sabotages the other, and then just the whole platform engineering initiative falls off the tracks. They need to be aligned. They need to be aligned on outcomes, goals, objectives, and collaborate on how you're going to get there. So timelines, phases, overcoming blocks, and identifying those risks early on. And those are the people that will also help you build that migration plan. So the best adoption strategies that I see are the ones that start with a solid migration plan from day zero. It considers logical time to add new applications and teams. It's very realistic, and it's also a living document. It's going to also consider how the technical complexity of a platform changes along the way. So not just this is when this team is going to come on, it's this is when this group is going to come on based on these common cohorts of requirements. So when you look at the iteration cycles of how you will start changing and building your platform, the best way to think about it is by a cohort and put teams or applications or business units in a similar cohort so that they're not just having their technical needs met, but their change management needs met as well. There's a bit of an art to that, to be fair, but it's definitely doable. And I'll touch a little bit on legacy services too. So you're probably going to encounter these in an enterprise setup and even in some non-enterprise setups. And it requires some deeper thinking as a technical organization as a whole. So what I mean by that is some orgs will have a plan for getting rid of these things, and some of them don't. If there is a plan on gradual sunsetting and replacement of legacy services, essentially the new projects that are being built to replace those can be treated as greenfield. Get them on the platform from day one. The minute those are being developed, they should be as on the platform, and that is the day-to-day process of building those services. So that's an easy win from a perspective of getting people off legacy services fast and easing the migration from what is probably very old school to a new way of thinking. If the legacy services aren't going away, they are not ever going to align with cloud native, with platform engineering. They're not going to fit that 12-factor application model as they are. Sometimes it may happen that when the rest of the org has transitioned to a platform and all the process, the time, resources around software development are streamlined, it is entirely possible that a sunsetting plan will actually be easier to sell. Like, hey, you want to get rid of these mainframes? We now have the time to really put effort into this and build something better. So that is sort of what I think about with those. When I talk about that iteration cycle, realistically, this is what I'm thinking about. So when you look at MVP and beyond, you want to think of it as part of a never-ending process. So what you are doing when you do an MVP is you're essentially doing part of a proof of concept. So you're taking developer needs, the best practices in the industry, and the existing tool chain you have, and building that into that POC. And a POC for me is two different parts. It's the MVP, which is the baseline improve portion of the proof of concept. And then you have the seed and scale portion, which is what I call production readiness. And production readiness means a lot of things to a lot of people, but in our case, it's getting a application team using that platform every single day for their day-to-day development work. Whether or not it actually deploys to full production, that's up to you. What's important though is that they're in their day-to-day, and that is how they're doing their job. Once you've done that, you have a fundamental proof of concept, and it's easy to then evolve and support and go through full scale adoption. And what you'll see in the cycle above is as you get new adopters, you're going to need to build new features. And you get that through getting feedback, through prioritizing that feedback and evolving the platform. And you're able to just keep going through this cycle over time. This is a product lifecycle thing. And realistically, if you start from having that platform as a product mindset from day one, this becomes very easy. One thing I want you to think about when you start thinking about adoption planning too, and I know that, we're going beyond MVP now, but it's important to have everything kind of in front of you when you're starting to think about this process. I want you to have these quick steps in mind for when you start doing adoption planning and how you're going to start thinking about these things. The first thing is you're going to define something. Objects and goals are always what I would start with, no matter what you're doing inside of this space. Next, you're going to decide not just the cohorts, but how you're going to prioritize them. So, what are those groups, those technology groups, those application groups that need to be brought on? What is common about them? What are the cohorts and how are they being prioritized? Next, you're going to do discovery. So, by cohort, look at the technical requirements that they have and work with that cohort on understanding how that will be built into the platform. The other thing you need to do is develop an internal marketing strategy. And this is quite hard, to be honest, because most of us who are engineers don't think about this stuff. But you need to have this in order to get buy-in and to get people excited about it. Even if you have a top-down initiative, even if everyone's being told they have to migrate, you still have to make that transition easy and you still have to make that product adoptable. That means stuff like documentation and training. And that's what I mean there too. And lastly, you're going to deliver an adoption model and a plan for scale. So take all of these other steps, put it into a concise plan, and be willing to get feedback on that and iterate on it too. But it is a lot easier to get sign off for a full scale adoption of a platform when you have something like this to begin with. Before I open up for questions, I want to leave you with this really nifty quote, which is that if you want something you've never had, you have to be willing to do something you have never done. And platform engineering is very much like this. You have to think a little bit differently. Shift your mindset from engineer to product owner. Shift that mindset from it's about technology to it's about change management and it's about culture. It's hard, but I promise you it's worthwhile. I see it every single day. So, with that being said, let's open up to questions.
I think there is the first question from Dominic. It says, how would you avoid early adopters from becoming legacy in the process of evolvement of an IDP?
Well, the whole idea is that by getting them being adopters, they are setting the foundation for how the rest of the platform will scale. So, I mean, if you're following platform as a product rules, generally speaking, those are the people that are going to represent 80% of the scenarios that you're going to hit. So you're covering a lot of ground, and chances are they're not easily going to become legacy. One way you could avoid that, though, is just by keeping those principles in mind and allowing teams to self-serve in order to move quickly and to stay up to date. And hey, if you need to upgrade Postgres to a new version for them, make sure that you get that done. Help them stay ahead of the game too. And then that kind of propagates through to the rest of the platform.
Great. We have some more questions. Choosing the right technology stack is always challenges. Consider rapid change in technology, how to deal with it.
The whole idea of a platform is that it should be about building blocks and be about pieces. So you should be able to take out components and change them if you are following the design rules of platform engineering well. It's always interesting to see people go down the path of locking into one cloud provider for everything. And I'm seeing a lot more people stop doing that and start thinking about how do they avoid just using only AWS services? Maybe they want to use other stuff too. So that's always a consideration to bring into place as well. But the idea is that it's very modular. So, your platform is a vending machine, and as a platform engineering team, your job is to take the products from infrastructure and operations, for instance, and make that available to developers inside of the vending machine. The vending machine products should change and grow over time, and you should add new ones and maybe get rid of old stale ones. That's how you have to think about it. It's all modular. That's a good question, though.
Awesome. So there's one more. Is it possible to have a future webinar about a deep dive inside one of your customer MVP to scale with focus on the migration and challenges?
Actually, I just recorded an interview last week with a customer that went through this. I'm not actually sure if it's live yet. I'll have to go double check. But we did an MVP with Simpris, which is the holding company for Vistaprint, and they are now going through this process of scaling quite large through their logistics organization. And actually, Nick, the director of technology over there, had some really, really great not just advice that came out of them doing the MVP, but they can really he really actually kind of walks through how they took that and scaled it. So once that's available, I think that's a cool thing to look at. That will be on the Humanitech YouTube channel, I believe. Um, but it's worth looking into because it's a cool story. And there's more of those coming. I just have to get around to recording the interviews with people. They don't always want to appear on camera. It's funny.
Thank you. So it says how to sell our ideas as acceptance criteria in platform engineering initiatives.
Well, it shouldn't just be your ideas. They should be collaborative. If you're just putting your ideas on paper and saying this is what we're going to do, it's not going to work. It has to be something where you consult stakeholders and get everybody together on the same page. So make sure you're doing that. Make sure you're understanding what the problems are you're actually trying to solve and be the annoying 7-year-old child that asks why constantly. Um, that's going to be the big thing. You need to be able to tie it all back into an overarching why. So yeah, it can't just be one person's ideas. It has to be very collaborative.
Great. How do you see the ACE impacting platform development?
The what?
Deb Ace, I think it is, or
Hold on, let
else.
me look.
You can check it out in the Q&A. The question is
Do,
from
do,
CP.
do. Oh, Dev AIs. Um,
Sorry.
no worries. Actually, I can tell you a really cool story about how AIs are probably going to affect platform development. This is something we're exploring right now at Humanitech. How do we take um, AI technology, specifically right now LLMs, and how do we tie that in to a platform? And what do we use with that power in order to make something very useful and not just useful because it looks cool, something actually legitimately useful. So um, we're talking a lot about our resource graph and how that graph can be used with an AI tool in order to provide not just insight, but management power and visibility, self-service, like a lot of cool things could be done with it. So that's one way it's being explored. Um, I think I've seen some interesting stuff in terms of testing as well, and kind of debugging that happens through deployment pipelines with AIs. There's just some interesting stuff starting to happen. So I think you'll see more and more as time goes on. It's a good question, though.
Andy asks, how does Humanitech ensure secure application delivery in regulated environments like hospitality, finance, and telecoms?
Great question. From a product perspective, we're SOC 2 Type 2 compliant, and we operate on, you know, the default kind of way things are configured is very much least privilege. Now, how application delivery is standardized in your context and how you take advantage of that is up to you. You have to design the platform using the orchestrator at the center, making sure that you're building in those requirements to your resource definitions, into your pipelines, into your self-service layer. And that's something we can help you with. But by nature, it's fairly easy to do with the way that the product actually works. There is I think it's next week. I'm doing an MVP with Humanitech workshop. So you may want to sign up for that and we'll get hands on and you'll see what I kind of mean by what that actually looks like.
Thank you. Do you see a link between IDP and the company itself offering its list of software on a platform?
So you mean it like to end customers or in terms of like a technology organization offering a list of like internal applications? Because I think you can see both. You could take that concept and transfer it, I think. I think you'll see um, external developer platforms become a thing. I mean, they kind of already are. Look at the all the hyperscalers, how they make their services available. So like I go in an AWS dashboard, I can click on and I want to make a new S3. or I can use an API call to do that. It would be a similar thing. And, that's the parallel you can draw is the idea of building your internal developer platform is very similar to what the hyperscalers do to enable us to go in and use a new tool. It's there, it's easy for me to figure out. And once I'm ready, I can go jump into doing all sorts of magic with it.
Okay, Harish asks, we are using a tool from a vendor and that company already built a platform. And this platform solution is not online with that, what would you use? For example, we want to use OpenShift, but the platform uses AKS. Is there something that we could build on top of this platform and customize it?
A platform should be able to be fairly tool/vendor agnostic. The idea behind a platform is that you can take those components out or add new ones in. Multi-cloud by design should be a thing. And when you look at how platforms are architected, if you haven't seen it, go look up the platform engineering reference architectures because that will give you an idea of, the components that should be part of that platform. If the default one you are using doesn't have that ability to do that, you need to reconsider whether or not it's the right thing. If it's important for you to have the ability to do OpenShift as well as EKS or AKS or whichever one you're using. It's a bit about evaluating priorities. Is it worth going and building that functionality in or starting from scratch, or can you get away with what you're doing for now? And then later down the road, do something better.
Any recommendations on how to choose an IDP platform?
Well, there are a lot of there's really no singular IDP per se. There are things that are platform as a service. They are going to work in some scenarios. They're not going to work in everything. So for example, like Heroku is a PaaS, a platform as a service, and I use it a lot for small projects because if it's just something that I'm working on, I just deploy it. It's a monolith. I don't care. Super easy. But once you start scaling and it becomes a big microservice offering, or it becomes a large team, or it becomes very distributed, has a lot of complex dependencies, that's when you actually want to build a proper platform. There are some, there's an open source platform, essentially kind of template, but I would say it's not really meant for large scale as well. It's called Canoe, CNOE, and it's from, I believe, mostly AWS. Actually, in the platform engineering course in the fundamentals, we use it as an example. We'll spin it up as well as something called the Pocket IDP, which is a little more vendor based, a little less open source, but still very, interesting to compare and contrast the both of them. And I go into exactly why we look at both of them in the course. I'm not going to tell you that here, it'd be a spoiler, but there is some stuff out there. However, start with the fundamental basics and understanding what you need to achieve with a platform before you start architecting it.
What stack of platform tools would you suggest?
I am biased, so you might not want to ask me that question. But I can give you a really interesting tool to use to start thinking about this. So I'm going to link you in the chat here to the platform engineering landscape. And in fact, let me just open it as a new window and share the screen a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. Maybe if Google Chrome would not be stupid. Let me share my screen. So this is on platformengineering.org. And what this is essentially a big platform tooling landscape map. Now, if people have submitted their tool to us, it is on here. If they haven't, then it's not. But what it shows you is across the 5 planes that we talk about in platform engineering, there are a lot of different tools. There's a lot of different things always coming in this space. So as a general rule, I would look through these and see what works for you. You can also go through the reference architectures talks from PlatformCon last year. So there's quite a few specific ones that folks brought in to talk about how they built their platforms, and maybe you'll get some ideas from there. In platform tools as well, you can search. You can go by the plane we're looking at, or you could look at a particular tool itself. So there's lots of options there. I have what I like and what I recommend and don't, but to be honest, it depends on what you're doing. So, yeah, it's a good question.
Great. We have a few more questions. Tom, it's saying, it's interesting to see the project management reference. Can you elaborate on that in a optional to use setting, no mandatory platform, and how this fits in a team topologies approach?
Still needs a project manager. It's still a project, regardless as to whether or not it's optional. Um, and in an optional setting, I think you're going to be more likely to have that project person also kind of be your product owner. Um, and what's important to realize is even if it's not a full-time role that someone has, there still needs to be someone filling that archetype. There still needs to be someone that acts as that product owner and as that project manager. It's just not going to work well if you don't have that. Doesn't matter whether or not it's optional or not. What they have to do is to focus on designing the platform so that it becomes the golden path, the easiest way forward to accomplish a task. And, in the sense of something being optional, I will always take the option that is going to save me the most time and be the least headache inducing. And I think most people are like that. So a good product owner and a good project manager will make sure that that is what they're building. The goal is to get everyone to use your platform. It's selling a product, regardless as to whether or not they don't actually have to do it. So that's the way I try to think about that. Um, yeah, I would doesn't really change.
Okay, we have a lot of questions now. So it says, how much freedom should developers or customers have when using a platform? And what constraints, if any, should be in place?
Golden paths, not golden cages. The whole idea is that you are giving someone an easier way to do something, to walk along the golden path. There should be guardrails in place based on things like security, based on things like best practice, standardization that you want to apply. And what that looks like will differ depending on whether or not you're a bank or you're a startup. Um, the really important thing is that you should allow people to go off the path if possible. Allow people to walk away from abstraction or to have a leaky abstraction, as long as it stays within the confines of what is required from a security and compliance perspective. But you should always incentivize the golden path. And the reason why is because it's the most efficient path. If people want to have fun deploying directly to Kubernetes on their own, give her, I don't care. But I don't need to spend as a developer a good portion of my day messing around with kubectl, or YAML, like 3,000 YAML files or Helm charts. I just don't want to do it. And I think a lot of engineering orgs are starting to realize that that's more common than we think. Allow people to walk off the path, but don't force them. And actually, there's a good blog post on this as well. Let me pull it up. Do. I think somewhere I will find it. Well, actually, there's a lot of these. So, okay, I'll have to find it. There is one on golden paths and golden path design, but then there's also ones on stuff like, understanding abstraction layers. What are you going to do there? Ah, there it is. I wrote these. I should know where they are. Here. Here you go. Good example of what a golden path is. So try to think of golden paths when you're trying to decide where people can and can't go and what they can and can't do.
Okay, are there any special considerations when working in customer environments with special security requirements regarding individual platform implementations where standard solutions don't fit?
Always. Always. I like to tell people to be best friends with their security teams. Be best friends with the people that do auditing and compliance, observability. In platform engineering terms, we call these cross-cutting concerns. These are things that are really important, and if they're not done right, people notice. It cuts a big hole or cuts a big bleeding artery right open. So, from day one, make sure that those people are consulted in the design of the platform. It is so much easier also to get adoption when you get security on board because security is like, yes, please standardize all the things, make our jobs easier, and they will become those advocates that you need to build in the process. So yeah, definitely just build it in from day one. Don't wait on it until too late.
So it says we are in the process of deciding whether to build or buy an IDP. Do you have any resources that can help with this?
I'm sure there are many. It depends on what you want to do and what you're trying to achieve. That might be one of those things. Shoot me an email and I can tell you what I honestly recommend. And it's going to depend on a lot of the outcomes you want and the time frame in which you want to achieve them. How much money you're willing to spend, how big your organization is. If you are 1,000-person team versus 100-person team, the amount of money you can probably invest in something like this is very different. So you can probably pay for that, $500,000 a year senior platform engineer that'll build this thing to your complete custom specs. Like you could probably justify that, but there is also, the whole don't reinvent the wheel thing. And there are some situations where building a component of a platform to make it work exactly for you is the right way to do it. There are some where it's a buy. Um, I'm not going to lie, I spend a lot of my time doing build versus buy comparisons for platform orchestrators because that's what I do. Um, and in a majority of circumstances, it's very expensive to get anywhere close to feature parity. Um, and that's just one of those things. Or even portals, actually, a lot of the time, honestly, what I see is that people just don't heat them at all. So, you have to really evaluate what you're trying to achieve there.
Okay, what is ideal platform stack for data products, considering boom in data?
I think this is a good question. I don't have any offhand. I'd have to think about that and go look at some of the stuff we've worked in and some of the customers we've worked with. Turns out I don't think about that as often as I should. About data products specifically.
Okay, Andy asks, does Humanitech provide cost monitoring for multi-cloud deployments?
So we are not a monitoring platform. That is not what we're made to do. So we are a platform orchestrator, which is its own thing. You would integrate monitoring into it. Now, it is very happy to do stuff like multi-cloud deployments and resource lifecycle management, all that fun stuff. But what you plug in to monitor is very much up to you. So it's one of those things where it's like we could build something that does a little bit for everybody, but it's going to be kind of crappy at a lot of things. We built something instead that is incredibly good at what it does and specializes in what it does and allows you to integrate with those other folks that do things very, very well.
Thank you. Okay, Simon asks, once you have all your dependencies mapped, what tools are available to help understand the macro scale architecture you have?
Ooh, I like this because we have a really cool way to solve this. Um, Now, keeping in mind, I know we're also talking to a platformengineering.org audience here, so this obviously isn't trying to be a sales pitch, but I will tell you that the really interesting way, so I'm just getting something pulled up here to think about this, is a fancy dancy thing called the resource graph. And I'm just going to share my screen. The idea of the platform orchestrator is that it enables your platform under the hood to look like this, where every single node, every single line on this visualization represents an API endpoint. The platform orchestrator's job is to be that API hub, realistically. At the end of the day, it is the thing that provides you with the platform's API. When it is done this way, you are able to visualize dependency, but also ask questions of it. So ask things like, show me everything this user can view in blue and edit in green. Show me what the downstream effect of this change is going to be. You could even, we call it kind of graph patterns. You could copy part of the graph, a pattern of it, and put it somewhere else. So like an ephemeral environment is essentially replicating part of the graph in an ephemeral context. That is really, really powerful. Um, I will be doing some videos on this soon and putting up some more information on this resource graph because it's very powerful. And this is the thing I was talking about with LLMs. It is this that, when combined with an LLM, will be very, very powerful. The questions you'll be able to ask of it and the things you'll be able to understand and see from a broader or even a constrained context are going to be pretty cool. And that is my sales pitch done for the day.
Awesome. Okay, a few last questions. So it says product owner versus architects to design the IDP. Maybe more
Mhm.
technical POs?
I mean, I tend to see the PO or multiple POs be kind of doing other things as well. So, like, maybe they're also a platform engineer that comes from a developer experience background. Maybe they're an infrastructure and operations. Maybe they're a DevOps person. Like, it's nice to have a different mix of perspectives in product ownership. So, whether or not you have a product owner or a group of people acting in that capacity, that's what's important. Just there needs to be someone to fill that role, and they should represent the people you're building the platform for, or at least have the knowledge. Like, I come from a DevX background. I'm a software engineer by background, so my bias in these conversations tends to be about DevX and about automation because that's what makes us happy. But if I was maybe a DevOps engineer, I'd come into it and say, no, 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 standardization is more important to me. I want to think more about that stuff. And from a product ownership perspective, you need to have those two to dance together because they play off each other. And without automation, standardization has no point. And without standardization, you can't actually automate anything. So it's that nice interplay between the two.
Mm, we have another question saying, should you eventually incorporate the deviations from the golden path into your abstraction? At which point?
You absolutely can, and it absolutely happens. An abstraction that leaks, a leaky abstraction, is a valid abstraction, especially when that leak is imperative to functionality. And what you'll find over time is you'll learn that what you built in the beginning, I mean, this happens with any product, may have to adapt and change because of how it's used or because how people use it. So, like, you build a product one way, someone goes and uses it to do something completely off the rails, but hey, turns out a lot of people do that and it works very well. You need to then iterate and shift in order to meet the needs of that customer. So yeah, it happens sometimes faster than not. Um, Totally valid thing to do.
Okay, the few last questions. Tom is asking for data platform. Check the Databricks offering. Okay,
Yeah,
never mind. It was a
Databricks. Yep.
comment.
No, no, Databricks, that is the one that keeps coming in my head. Yeah, it's just I don't think about data specifically enough because I think a lot about the application space. So, Databricks is what came to my mind. Yeah, it's a good one.
And then we have one. Is it better to cherry pick champions from the existing or hire externally?
Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's either. I would think if you have an org with a very strong culture of like some influential people, it's really healthy to have those champions from inside. It's also not wrong though to bring in external people, especially when maybe the org is just thirsty for a different perspective. Maybe it's been stagnant. Maybe the culture is sort of bleh. And that external person coming in and maybe they have really cool experience that people buy into, they become, that fast champion. I have seen it though, where someone is brought in, hired to essentially be a champion, and everyone just sort of sabotages their goals because they're not aligned with the culture of the team. They're a new person, they don't understand anything. Um, Developers as a whole, we tend to be fairly cliquey. As much as I'm afraid to admit it, it's true. We're very cliquey. And, an external person being the only person coming in can be quite problematic there. So there's a bit of a dance that you have to play with internal politics. But I would always start with internal, honestly. External is very dangerous to do very, very early on.